So I want to start out right away tossing out a question to you that I like to do always in these seminars. And the question is this. If I were to ask you, when is it likely that net immigration from Mexico to the United States is going to reach zero, what would you say? When do you think that's likely to happen? When is it? There you go. Only a professor would know. It's a trick question. Net immigration to the United States from Mexico reached zero. Zero. I think actually back in 2012. A couple of years have gone by since immigration to this country from Mexico reached zero, net immigration. That doesn't mean that no one's been coming across the border for the last couple of years, obviously. What it means is that the people who are coming across the border, both legally and illegally, and I don't know how they map that, but they do, whoever they are, the number, if you took that number and you paired it to the number of people who came across the border illegally and legally in the past and are moving back to Mexico, if you took those two numbers together, the ones leaving, the ones coming, it's a wash. You get to zero, which is a really interesting number to keep in mind as we go through this discussion tonight. We are in the midst of a debate in this country about what to do about immigration, about the larger U.S.-Mexico relationship. And it's presented as a crisis for our country, for policy, and so forth. And it's an issue. It's an important issue. But keep in mind that as we go through this discussion, that number hit zero, and it did it a couple of years ago. I think that's particularly significant. I want to throw another number at you. 0.111111. Or that is to say, a fraction, 1/9. 1/9 of all the Supreme Court justices in the United States are Hispanic. Which is to say, how many are there? There's one. Which is a significant number. This is the brethren. This is the keepers of the creed. These are the powerful people in this country, the members of the Supreme Court. And of that membership, one is now Hispanic. That is a substantial, substantial fact. By the way, do any of our students or anyone want to say, what is the name of that Chief Justice? Sotomayor. Sonia Sotomayor. That's right. Now I'm going to give you another number. Number 1. Since 1938, I believe it was, 38, 39, there has been one oil company in Mexico. Does anyone know the name? Pemex. Pemex, since the late 30s, has been a nationally owned company. There's only been one of them. They've had a monopoly on the energy sector. That fact has shaped a lot of the current reality of what is Mexico in terms of politics, economics, etc. The government of Mexico, under President Peña Nieto, has decided to denationalize that oil industry, that company. That one is now going to become many. As we think about Mexico as an evolving economy, that is a single fact that we can point to as an excellent indicator of where Mexico is coming, or going rather. Development is happening in that country, and we as Americans and policymakers or policy-interested people need to be aware of that. Next number is number 2. There are currently 2 very prestigious organizations who have decided that the most important future policy issue for the United States has to do with U.S.-Mexico relations and North American integration more generally. Harvard's Belfer Center, which is sort of the tip of the spear of research at the Kennedy School, and the Council on Foreign Relations recently both launched a task force on studying the future of North America, and in particular U.S.-Mexico relations, because they think this is the future. If they think it's the future, we should be taking this very seriously as well. Okay, the next number I want to throw out is number 3. Mexico is the 3rd largest trading partner of the United States. When you think of the size of the American economy, and then you think that Mexico is number 3 as a trading partner, that is obviously an extremely significant fact. Now, number 1, does anybody know?
China?
Canada's number 1. China's number 2. Mexico's #3 trading partner. By the way, unless my numbers are off on this, anyone know what number 4 is? It's the European Union as a whole. Mexico is a bigger trading partner than the European Union as a whole. Now, our guest might have much, in fact, I'm certain has much more accurate data than I was able to get my hands on, but that's what I read. That tells you how significant this relationship is. I'll throw out another number 3. There have been 3 democratic transitions of power in Mexico since it became a full-on democracy in the year 2000. Just out of curiosity, could anyone name the 3 presidents in Mexico since 2000? So Fox was the first one. No one? Calderon, and now Peña Nieto. 3 democratic transitions means that is a real democracy. They are denationalizing their oil industry. They are our 3rd major trading partner. That is an important country. A couple more little numbers here. I really like this one. The number 4. There are 4 counties in the United States that constitute 23% of all people of Mexican origin in the United States. Essentially, a quarter of all the people from Mexico in some fashion in this country are in just 4 counties, which is the other end of the spectrum. On the one hand, it's really important to think about our relationship between the United States and Mexico. On the flip of it, when people tell you, oh my God, this country is changing fundamentally because there's such massive immigration, well, a quarter of all those immigrants coming from Mexico are in, let me make sure I get this right, Los Angeles County, Harris County, which is Houston, Cook County, Chicago, and Orange County. Interesting fact. Just a couple more. Double 4 is 8, and 8th, the rank of 8th, is the rank of the last name Garcia in the most popular, most widely used last names in this country. Garcia is number 8 of all the last names in this country. If you think about that for a minute, that's kind of interesting. You know what's at number 9? Rodriguez. Very interesting fact. 3 more numbers really quick. 13.2%, that's the number I have of all U.S. trade that's traded with Mexico. It's substantial. 17%, the number of people in this country who are of Hispanic origin. 17%. It's almost a fifth, that's huge. And the final number I want to toss in your direction, and it's particularly relevant for us here in this room, 63.4%. 63.4%. Before I tell you what that represents, does anyone want to guess what that number is for? Nobody. It could be anything, so I'll just tell you. 63.4% is the amount that the Hispanic population has increased in Ohio since the year 2000. Since the year 2000, 63.4% increase. Now, I'm from California. I grew up in an environment in which Hispanic immigration was the norm. In fact, my town, I believe, is now over 50% Hispanic from when I grew up in. But in Ohio, it's very easy to think that these are topics that, while relevant to the country, don't affect us nearly as much. Quite the opposite. Times are changing, and we need to understand that change. Just last Tuesday was when Barack Obama's policy initiative on immigration was supposed to kick into high gear. It didn't, because it's being held up in a court in Texas. People are contesting his immigration initiative. But the fact of the matter is that play out of policy reflects a fundamental fact in this country, which is that we need to understand how to engage Mexico in a way that is thoughtful, meaningful, proactive, and in the long-term interest of both countries. It's becoming ever more important, and we need to understand it. And to do that, we brought to you today, I think, the ideal guest, if I may say so, to address these topics. His name is Mr. Christopher Wilson, and he's from the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. The first thing you need to understand about this, in case you're not familiar with the Wilson Center, is that he does not own it. It is not his. It was not even named after him. It was named after another Wilson, I believe, whose first name was Woodrow. And
I'm taking over, though.
Oh, perfect. It's going to be a smooth transition. They are really the best of the best when it comes to studying U.S.-Mexico policy. So we couldn't have gone to a better place, and Mr. Wilson himself is someone who brings the perfect combination of background experience for our purposes, because we want to talk today about immigration, but we want to talk about a lot of other things as well. We want to talk about economic relationships between our countries, and a whole host of other things. And his background is as a policy analyst, but also as an analyst in the private sector, in finance. He's lived and worked in Mexico. He lives, obviously, and works now in the United States in Washington, D.C. And he's able to talk to all these different topics in a way that's going to be very meaningful for us today. So I'm so pleased to be able to have him here with us. And what we're going to do is have one of our Garfield scholars come on up here and give him a full-on, proper introduction, telling you just how impressive he is. And then we're going to have a talk, as we normally do, for about 40-45 minutes, after which we'll have question and answer. And then, of course, for those of you who signed up for it, we'll be having dinner over in Kortansky Hall, which is a little different than we normally do. As you can see, we're not normally in our ballroom experience. There was another event that caught that first, and then there's another event in this room after us this evening. So we'll be going over to Kortansky Hall, but basically our usual setup is in play. So without further ado, I'm going to have John Onasco come on up here and give an introduction, and then we'll get to hear Mr. Wilson.
Hello everyone, and welcome. I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Mr. Christopher Wilson, the Senior Associate at the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Mr. Wilson completed his MA in International Affairs at American University, focusing on U.S. foreign policy and hemispheric relations. He directs the Institute's research and programming on regional economic integration and U.S.-Mexico border affairs. Since his time at the Wilson Center, he has authored the book, Working Together, Economic Ties Between the United States and Mexico, which analyzes the ways in which regional economic cooperation can enhance competitiveness, stimulate growth, and create jobs. This report provides a comprehensive look at the value, composition, and effects of each state's trade with Mexico. In addition, Mr. Wilson co-authored the State of the Border Report, released by the Wilson Center, which analyzed the state of affairs in the management of the U.S.-Mexico border and the border region, focusing on 4 core areas: trade competitiveness, security, sustainability, and quality of life. Along with his publications, Mr. Wilson has testified before the U.S. Congress and is regularly consulted by national and international media outlets regarding U.S.-Mexico relations. He has previously worked as a contractor doing analysis for the U.S. military and as a researcher at American University's Center for North American Studies. In Mexico, he worked with the international trade consultancy, Inteligencia Comercial, and with American students studying regional, political, and social issues. If you all could join me in giving Mr. Wilson a warm welcome.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much, James, for the nice words of welcome to both of you, actually, and to the entire campus here. It's great to be here. Great to be able to talk about this topic that I spend a lot of time on, and I think I agree is increasingly important to the United States. If I can, I'll just say just one word or two about the Wilson Center to give you guys a little bit of context of where I come from. It's a nonpartisan, bipartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. It's also the official memorial of President Woodrow Wilson. And the interesting fun fact there is that he's still actually, to date, the only U.S. president to ever had a PhD. So in some ways, he represents the coming together of the worlds of policy and the worlds of academia. And that's what we try to do in our own work at the Wilson Center, is be a space where we can bring real, serious academic research to play and to bear on the policy debates happening in Washington. I'm going to talk about first some changes that are going on in Mexico, some changes that have really been underway for the last couple of decades, but have made some important modifications to the landscape, and then go into the impact of that on U.S.-Mexico relations, how that impacts us here. I want to start off with a question for y'all. Imagine we didn't just hear those facts that we just heard from your professor. That aside, what comes to mind? What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Mexico? Just throw out a few words. Anything is fine. Immigration. What else?
Cisco Kid.
What's that?
The Cisco Kid.
Cisco Kid. Excellent. All right, we've got a different group here. It turns out that what comes to mind, the word that comes to mind most for 45% of Americans is drugs. There are lots of other words that also come to mind. And the question was basically, this was a survey from 2 years ago, the question was basically just that. Thinking of Mexico, what are 3 words that come to mind? Drugs, unsafe, poor, corrupt, poverty, crime. You get some good stuff in there occasionally. Beaches, food. I think tacos is in there somewhere specifically. So there are some nice associations. But the majority of the words there are not necessarily so nice. The impression overall, what first comes to mind is not necessarily so positive. And one of the things that I want us to be thinking about as I go through the presentation is what's the impact of this on our policy? Right? What's the impact of perception on policy? And I think there are several ways in which it gets inserted into the political sphere, whether it's because of public perception, whether it's because of media portrayals, whether it's because of the actual understanding of policymakers themselves, or perhaps misunderstandings sometimes of the country. But let me move ahead a little bit. Some of those negative ideas are based in reality. I don't want to gloss over that in any way, shape, or form. Picked together just a few pictures that tell some of the stories of debates that are currently playing out in Mexico. Over the last 6 or 8 months, there's really been, actually a little more than that now, several different crises unfolding that remind us of some of the challenges that we as Americans think we know are taking place in Mexico. Top left, you've got a picture of a house bought by the finance minister of Mexico. He got a very preferential deal on the mortgage for that house because the company that gave him the mortgage happened to be a preferred company, construction company for the state of Mexico, which is where he used to work before he became the national finance minister. A similar deal with this house here on the bottom right. They call that the Casa Blanca, the White House. It became such a controversy that when President Peña Nieto was coming to Washington, he was just there last month in January. They said he had a visit to the White House. Mexicans asked which one, because they thought he might be talking about this White House. It was a similar deal. His wife actually got this great sort of sweetheart deal on this house, also related to a different construction firm in Mexico. So there's issues of corruption, what types of interests are involved in those 2 purchases of homes. Top right, we have 4 soldiers, low-level soldiers, importantly, that were arrested after a massacre in Tlaxcala. It's in the state of Mexico, not too far from Mexico City. They were alleged criminals that they killed, but they were extrajudicial killings. They were, the story that came out initially was that they were killed in a fight between organized crime groups and the military who were doing security work in the area. What came out later on was that they were actually executed, that they were rounded up and executed extrajudicially. So there's some issues of human rights abuses there. And then the biggest scandal of them all that's playing out in Mexico right now has to do with the disappearance of 43 students. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it in Guerrero, southwest Mexico. They were disappeared. There was a collusion they're from Ayotzinapa. They were disappeared in Iguala, both in the state of Guerrero. They were protesting. They went to have some sort of a protest, but also actually raising some funds in this small, medium-sized city in the state. The local mayor, his wife, was going to have an event that day, a public event. Some people say she was trying to set up her own candidacy for mayor in the future. They both didn't like the idea that these people would be coming in and sort of causing trouble in the area. They happened to have very close relationships with the local organized crime group. In fact, the mayor's wife, her brothers were the leaders of it. They called them up. They told them to deal with the situation. We don't know exactly what was said. They disappeared and still to date are missing. We don't really know what happened, but they were taken by the organized crime group, taken by police, passed over to the organized crime group, and most people would believe killed. This has caused a huge outrage in Mexico, and that's important because that underscores one of the other transformations that's in play, how society is willing to accept or not willing to accept these types of events. But those perceptions of corruption, of drugs, of organized crime, they're based in a reality, absolutely. So let's start there, but that's not the whole story. there's a whole other story about what Mexico is and what it's becoming. This just really quickly just shows, let's see, so for those, you can read it pretty easily, but this is GDP growth projections. It goes into projections into the future. Mexico in red, the US in blue. The point that I want to make here is just that Mexico is growing faster than the United States. Mexico's economy is growing faster than the US. Not like China, but still faster than the United States. So there's, only over recent years, a slight tendency towards convergence there. But it would be a long road to follow before we actually get to any sort of real parity between the United States and Mexico. Poverty is persistent. About 50% of Mexico still lives in poverty. There's a really important flip side to that fact, right? 50% are poor. That means 50% are not poor. They're either in the middle class or a small, segment that are actually wealthy. So 50% middle class. This is a really important factor in what's happening in Mexico right now, on the political side and on the economic side. Highly competitive manufacturing industries. Some of the fastest growth in terms of the auto industry in the world. China and Mexico are the quickest growing countries in terms of how much they're upping production. It's one of the world leaders in that. Aerospace industry is doing extremely well in Mexico. These are high quality industries that have an impact on the quality of life of the citizens. So how did this come about, some of these changes economically over the last couple of decades in Mexico? Let's take a step back and do a little bit of background. For 70 years in Mexico, starting in the 1930s, the PRI, the Institutionalized Revolutionary Party, was in control and were the only party in control. So this is not a democratic system, this is a single party system. So closed in terms of politics, in terms of democratic participation in politics, closed in terms of economy, had an import substitution based economy for years, for decades. So it means they put up high tariff walls, trying to protect their domestic industries in order to let them grow up and do what they hoped was to become competitive internationally. That was successful for a while, actually, during the 50s and 60s especially, but the 40s also. A lot of people were able to improve their quality of life as Mexico industrialized, but that economic model sort of ran out of strength, ran out of juice, and ran into some serious problems in the 70s and early 80s with finding of oil, taking on excessive debt, crashing the economy, doing that again. 80s is known as the lost decade in Mexico. An economic model that had come to the end of its usefulness, and a people pushing for change in terms of democracy. So you have a push for and a need for opening both on the economic front and on the political front. You have a party in power that's pretty good at keeping themselves in power. So they made a bet. Their bet was, we'll open economically so we don't have to open politically. And so they figured if we can let people still, if people feel prosperous, it's sort of the bet that China's making today. It's a complex thing to analyze, so I don't want to go too far into that, but I think in a certain way it is the bet that China's making today. So they say, if we open economically, if we find a way to restart growth, to jumpstart growth, well then there won't be as much pressure for change of power for democracy in the country. And so they start opening up the economy. They've joined the GATT, which is a precursor to the World Trade Organization, have to lower some of their tariff barriers to do that. They privatize several banks, they allow increased foreign investment, they sell off a lot of state-owned industries. Pemex was one of the ones that didn't get sold off at that time, the oil industry. But all this really culminated with something that was revolutionary, it was groundbreaking, and that was the North American Free Trade Agreement. Why was it groundbreaking? I mean, it was a free trade agreement that lowered trade and investment barriers between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. But it was revolutionary for Mexico because it implied a change in the notion of sovereignty of the country. This is a country that, since the Mexican-American War, and even before then, was worried that the United States was going to take over Mexico, and in fact, did take over half of Mexico, right? So Mexico lost all this territory to the United States. Ever since then, there's a huge sense of we need to keep the giant at bay, the giant imperialists at bay. We need to hold them at arm's length so that we can maintain our sovereignty. And that philosophy, that feeling, actually was articulated into Mexico's foreign policy through a policy of non-interventionism. but it was a sense. It was the sort of the guide for Mexico's relations with the world and with the United States. Well, NAFTA flipped all that on its head. NAFTA said, no, actually, instead of trying to keep the United States at bay, we will invite them in. We will cooperate with them in an effort to cooperatively make the entire region stronger. So it was a switch in the notion of sovereignty, and it was an invitation to cooperation rather than antagonism, essentially. That's on the economic front. Don't get me wrong, the story in terms of economics is more complicated than that. Right after NAFTA was implemented, Mexico's economy crashed for a set of different reasons. It hasn't been an easy ride, but it has transformed Mexico and its economy. Some of the things that NAFTA did do, though, was it forced Mexican companies to compete, right? The ones that were exposed to trade and investment from around the world, they're competitors locally, or they had competitors from abroad, so they had to compete. Well, there were some companies that didn't succeed in that, but there were a number of Mexican companies that did succeed, and they became world-class companies, and that's something I'm going to talk about in just one second. Another thing NAFTA did, it locked in rules. It locked in rules which made foreign companies more comfortable investing in Mexico. So it attracted a lot of investment into Mexico. That helped jumpstart the economy. It brought in manufacturers that were already world-class manufacturers to be operating in Mexico. Customers got better prices and better product availability. When Walmart moves in, your prices do drop. However everyone feels about Walmart here, nobody can say they don't have low prices. That's definitely true. And so it did. It transformed the economy, this process of opening up Mexico's economy. Thinking about some of that transformation, what does that look like on the ground? Well, let's think about maquiladoras on the one hand. These are the industries that started out in the border region and then expanded to all of Mexico, which is assembly plants, factories that were assembly plants. They're basically looked at Mexico's advantage as being close to the United States and having cheap labor, and said, well, there's some of the high, labor-intense activities that you all are doing in the United States. Let's move them to Mexico. We can do them cheaper. We'll give people jobs in the process. Started out in Ciudad Juarez, right across from El Paso, Texas. That was the birthplace of that industry. Started out, the first maquiladora was sewing blue jeans. Other ones that developed early on were actually doing things even like sorting coupons, so that you'd go to the grocery store and use coupons to save some money. They'd send a big pile of those to Mexico, make people sort them out into piles and give them back to the companies that were going to reimburse the local supermarkets. It's very low-skill labor, right? That's the point that I'm trying to make there. And compare that to what's growing, what's booming in Mexico right now, auto industry, aerospace industry. This is different, right? It's the model may have come from an opening, but what's happened over time is there's been a movement up the value chain. And that's been through processes of competition, not just from the United States, but also think about competition from places like China, Vietnam, Cambodia. They have lower wages than Mexico does. So some of those, the jobs in the textile industry were lost. Thankfully, Mexico's found a way to move up into industries that require a little bit higher level of skill. And importantly, and this is what this shows, maquiladoras generally have bus systems, private bus systems to bring their workers in. Their workers oftentimes live way out on the outskirts of town, places that don't have traditional bus service. So to get them to work, they had to have their own bus lines. That's what that is, it's a bus for maquiladoras. On the right, this is an aerial shot of a Ford plant in Hermosillo, Mexico, in northwestern Mexico. And it's probably pretty hard to see, but the reason I grabbed that photo is because it has about 4 or 5 parking lots around it. People drive to work there. It's a pretty big difference in terms of lifestyle. Having to depend on company transport, living out in the shanty town outside of town, to being able to own your own car and drive to work. It's not a huge difference in wages, but it's a pretty significant one in terms of the quality of life that it's offering people. I told you I was going to talk about what happened when Mexican companies were exposed to global competition. But what happened is they became world-class, some of them, the ones that were able to stay afloat, and they went global themselves. They took the competition back to us. Bimbo, have you ever heard of Bimbo breads? I don't know, maybe a couple of you. Have you ever heard of Sara Lee? They just bought them a couple of years ago. They own them now. Entenmann's, they own them. They're one of the largest food companies in the world. They're the largest baked goods company in the United States and in the world, actually. Gruma, they make tortillas. You might expect that from a Mexican company. They're world class there. They're the biggest in the world. They sell wraps, all that. That's growing in China right now. They've actually been one of the Mexican companies and really Western companies that's had the biggest takeoff in China. They've done an extremely good job adapting to that environment. Cemex is the largest cement maker in the Americas, North and South. This is an interesting one because Telmex, this is Carlos Slim, one of the richest men in the world, right? Goes back and forth with Bill Gates and the likes of being the top richest man in the world. Well, his industry was not one of those ones that was opened up to competition in Mexico for years. And now there's an opening underway. But for years it was a completely closed system. He was a monopoly. Before that it was a government monopoly. They sold it to him, which was ridiculous. And he had the monopoly, so he just got to charge people whatever he wanted to give them bad phone service. But what's so interesting is when he had to go and compete abroad, he was able to do that. He's been very successful throughout Latin America. Now he's in Europe as well, and he's competing. He's able to be a world-class company. He owns part of the New York Times. I just think that's an interesting one. Sort of a little bit shocking to think that the New York Times is about now. He just bought some more recently. It's about 20% Mexican-owned at this point. Beer, Corona has become very popular in the United States. That's Modelo. That's also one of these markets that was opened up and is now doing very well. It's an interesting story because there's a lot of back and forth. Actually, all the grain that's used to make beer in Mexico is mostly grown in the United States. Gets shipped to Mexico, they make the beer, now they're selling the beer back to us. So these are some of these companies that were able to succeed in rising to the level of competition that Mexico exposed itself to by opening up economically. Recently, there's been, with the most recent government, the government of Peña Nieto, a major reform effort underway. Some of the economic reforms that had started in the 80s and 90s sort of got stuck because Mexico was undergoing a political transition as well. With political transition came divided government. With divided government, as we know very well, comes the inability to do anything in Congress. And so Mexico lived that for a long time. Somehow they just got past it. 2012, the new president was elected. Something called the Pact for Mexico was created, a sort of a deal between the three major political parties. And it was a deal on a legislative agenda. There were 90 some odd points on this legislative agenda. And it actually included a lot of things that the previous party that was in power was trying to get done themselves in terms of economic reforms. So they went along with them, and they passed all these major reforms. An anti-monopoly reform, a banking reform, an education reform. I mean, these are doing things like, in banking, making it easier to move between banks so customers can have better service and banks have to compete a little bit more. In education, taking on a teachers' union that was historically, corrupt and had really taken over the education system from the government. In energy, which is the biggest of them all in terms of, in economic terms, they had rules where there was no, in Mexico in the 1930s, the energy sector was nationalized. That day where they took their energy industry from those bad foreigners, that day was celebrated as a national holiday every year, actually still is. So this was like a sacred cow. I mean, this was something you could not touch because this symbolized Mexico's sovereignty and its power and its ability to stand up to foreigners that were trying to come in and steal their national wealth. So what they did though, but unfortunately what happened is in the 1970s they found a huge amount of oil, Cantarell, one of the biggest oil fields underneath the Gulf of Mexico, and they developed Pemex into a little plastic straw. That's how you should think of it, Pemex. And Pemex was very good at sticking that straw into this one massive oil well and sucking oil out of it. But it fed all that money right into the government. 30 to 40% of the government's budget came from that straw. And so the government depended on it. And so when they started running out of oil there, they weren't letting Pemex reinvest in itself to learn how to go after the rest of the oil. Mexico has lots of other oil, but it doesn't have the capacity to go after it because it has a kind of slow-moving bureaucracy that's not allowed to invest back in itself. So rules were changed to allow it to invest back in itself, but also to invite in foreign competition and foreign investment, foreign expertise to tap into, and not just foreign, actually, domestic also, of course, to tap into some of those reserves that were previously off limits or unreachable in Mexico. So this one is probably, in terms of economic impact, the largest of the reforms. Could double Mexico's foreign investment over the next couple of years pretty easily. A fiscal reform, some changes in tax policy. That one's kind of controversial, actually, in terms of whether or not it's positive. A political reform that allows limited re-election of members of Congress. This was a really important thing politically. Before that, you had all these members of Congress that didn't know how to be members of Congress because they could only stay there for a couple years at a time and then had to leave, so they could never develop expertise, and they weren't being held accountable by the members in their district. So this is actually political, not economic, but it was very important as well. And there was telecom reform that had to do with TV and telephone and broadcasting. This is the one that makes it harder for Slim to rule the world in Mexico, and it also means that you'll probably have in the next couple of years more than just 2 TV conglomerates that run everything, which there are right now. Major reforms. There's a lot there. Could talk about them for a long time, but it's interesting because this process of transition is still going on. That takes us pretty much up to date. This is the cover of one of Mexico's biggest newspapers today, actually. And the reason I have it up here is because of this guy here in the middle. He won best. He was director for the movie that won Best Picture last night. Alejandro González Iñárritu. He made Birdman. And what's really interesting about it is it symbolizes, I think, a couple of things. One is you don't have people that win Oscars for something like that. They had a director that won an Oscar last year for Gravity. I mean, this is sort of it's a theme. It's not just a one-off. That happens when you have a middle-class society. When you have people that are able to go to college, study to be in creative industries, not just in a sort of basic industries that you would send your kids to if you were coming immediately out of poverty. Having a strong middle class is what allows you to have a strong creative class, and this is an expression of that. But it also says below, it says, gana Oscars y pide mejor gobierno. He got on stage and he said, we need a better government for Mexicans, because he's not okay with the fact that 43 students went missing a few months ago, because he's not okay with the fact that these sweetheart deals are happening where the ministers and the president's wife are getting houses for almost free because they're giving away government contracts to certain people. He's not okay with that, and he's speaking out about it because he feels empowered to do so. And this change, this economic change to creating opportunities to grow a middle class that's now 50% of society leads to pressures on government to continue political change. So not only did some of the economic reforms get a bit stagnated, but there was a political opening that happened as well that also stagnated for many years. And so that pressure is underway still today. So let's go into how does all of this impact U.S.-Mexico relations? We heard a few of the numbers right off the bat. Mexico is, I'm going to start with the economic side of things, and I'm going to go into other pieces of the relationship. I mean, the economic story between the United States and Mexico, I think, can be summed up in 2 words: big and deep. It's big. It's our 3rd largest trading partner, our 2nd largest export market. Trade today is 5 times, actually 6 times now, what it was before NAFTA. Trade $1 million per minute between the countries. There are more exports to Mexico than to all of the BRICS, the supposedly fast-growing countries, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa combined. More exports to Mexico than all of those countries combined. Trade growth with Mexico over the last few years has grown faster than trade growth with China, faster than trade growth with any other major trading partner of the United States. So it's big and it's growing. It's really big. 6 million U.S. jobs depend on U.S.-Mexico trade. It's an important fact. But it's also deep. It's also the nature of the relationship with Mexico that's very different than, say, the relationship with China. When we import a product, with the lowering of barriers, with geographic proximity, which we always have had with Mexico, and the lowering of trade and investment barriers, we created a continental platform for manufacturing. Goods now, complex goods, are not manufactured just in the United States and then sold to Mexico, or just in Mexico and then sold to the United States, or sold anywhere. They're created between the countries. So think of the auto industry is a perfect example. It's a very complex thing that you're building. It has thousands of parts to it. Those parts go back and forth across the US-Mexico border, and the US-Canada border for that matter. They say a couple of thousand of actual border crossings. They say the main components of a car, as it's being built in North America, cross one of the borders in North America around 8 times. So that's like the whole car itself basically moving back eight times as the car is being created. So we have this continental platform, and this shows a stat that helps understand that. When we import a final good, now not these parts, but when we import a final good from Mexico, on average, 40% of the value in that good was built right here in the United States. When we import a final good from China, 4% on average was built here in the United States. Why? Because you can't have supply chains that go crisscrossing back and forth across the Pacific Ocean. It's just too expensive, right? And we don't have this type of trade arrangement that we have with Mexico set up with China. So, 4 cents of every dollar that we spend on Chinese goods stay in the United States, but 40 cents on every dollar that we spend on imports from Mexico stay in the United States. So if you're thinking about who you want to have as your trading partner in terms of your own self-interest, well, clearly your neighbors are the ones that you want to have as your main trading partners, right? Because the nature of that relationship is quite different than the nature of that trading relationship with a country that's much further away. So Canada is 25%, similarly high. So thinking a little bit about security and border management. During the Cold War, there was sort of an implicit deal between Mexico and the United States. Mexico had a revolution in 1910, and it was a real revolution. It was the people rising up to take back from those who, the caudillos, the few, the aristocrats that owned everything in the country. And they did that. What happened afterwards was complicated, but there was a real revolution, a real rising up of people, of the poor, to claim something. And so there was because of that, there's an affinity with the left around the world. So that was a little bit threatening to the United States during the Cold War because we were concerned. We think of like the Cuban Missile Crisis. We certainly didn't want Soviet influence 90 miles south of Miami and didn't want nuclear weapons being stationed there. Well, we certainly didn't want it on our border either, at our doorstep, less than 90 miles away, less than 1 mile away. So we were very concerned about Mexico, but there was an implicit deal there, which was basically, Mexico, you can do pretty much what you want. Go ahead, get in the non-aligned movement, talk to Cuba, have a good relationship with Cuba, say some anti-American stuff every now and then, but don't get close with the Soviet Union. And that was sort of the deal. So it was this, Distant Neighbors is the name of a book that characterized the relationship back in the early 80s. There was a distance between the United States and Mexico. There was in some ways also a system of mutual recrimination because there were irritants that grew over time also, despite this bargain, around migration, unauthorized immigration into the United States, around the trafficking of drugs through Mexico to the United States, sometimes being produced in Mexico in terms of marijuana, especially at that time. So we had some friction points in the relationship, and the United States blamed Mexico for sending drugs and unauthorized migrants north. And Mexico turned around and blamed the United States for sending money, that illicit money, to be laundered back through Mexico and to corrupt its politicians back to Mexico, and sending weapons to Mexico, because we know that the large majority of weapons being used by organized crime organizations in Mexico come from the United States, and that's been true for a while. So we had this system of mutual recrimination in play, where each side just blames the other. We had a drug certification process where our Congress had to decide whether or not Mexico was doing enough to stop drug trafficking every year. It was a big point of friction in the relationship. There was a DEA agent in the 80s, Kiki Camarena, who was kidnapped and tortured and killed in Mexico. This was a major point of conflict, and then the United States sent some people in to get some of the people they thought were responsible, sort of similar to when we went into Pakistan without telling them and without their permission necessarily to go after Osama bin Laden. This was a violation from their perspective of sovereignty, and from ours it was the capture, torture, and killing of one of our agents. So this was a major source of conflict. If we thought of NAFTA as a flipping of sovereignty, of that notion, that traditional Mexican notion of sovereignty, on its head, we could think of the Merida Initiative as that for security, perhaps. The Merida Initiative is what's still current. It was started in 2007 to 2008 as the main vehicle for security assistance, but also cooperation between the United States and Mexico, mainly in response to the issue of rising strength of organized crime groups and rising levels of violence related to that. So with the Merida Initiative, Mexico invited, this is under President Calderon, invited the US to cooperate, to collaborate much more closely in going after organized crime groups in particular. Over time, it evolved to be something a little deeper than that, not just about going after the bad guys, but also building rule of law institutions, helping Mexico with the justice reform to change from an antiquated system to an adversarial, open system of justice. But it was really important because it switched from mutual recrimination to, and this was the term of art for it, shared responsibility, saying this is a transnational issues, whether it's drug trafficking or transnational organized crime groups, and so we need to have an international, binational, cooperative, collaborative response to them. And so it was a switch from mutual recrimination to shared responsibility. There's also a notion of the 21st century border. Let me jump ahead to talk about immigration for a second, and then I'll weave back into this. But migration, I would say, if there are three big issues in U.S.-Mexico relations over time that are perennial, it's the economics, it's security, and it's migration. And I think this is still it's changed. The story itself, the on-the-ground phenomenon, are changing in major ways. But the policy response has never undergone this NAFTA moment, this Merida Initiative moment, this switch from antagonism to collaboration. We still don't have a policy framework that allows us to think about migration and the movement the movement within our workforce, the movement of individuals for whatever reasons, for educational reasons, for work reasons in general, but also to be back with family. We don't have a framework that allows us to think about that in anything except for traditional sort of Westphalian state, traditional concept of what borders are, this is us, this is them type of a mentality. But the reality is that we have levels of social integration. We have levels of economic integration that are unprecedented. We have levels of social integration that are unprecedented. 10% of the U.S. population is of Mexican origin. So that's not just Hispanic, which is an even larger percentage of the U.S. population, but just of Mexican origin, whether you're, and this breaks it down actually, whether you're born in the United States, meaning Mexican American, basically, or whether you're foreign born, so actually an immigrant from Mexico. Out of all of it, it's a pretty small, 18% of the 10% are unauthorized immigrants. So it's a few million that are unauthorized, but it's more that are either U.S. citizens of Mexican origin or are authorized migrants to be in the United States. Likewise, 10% of Mexicans live in the United States. Mexico is a big country. That's a big chunk of its population that's living in the United States today. And this is the point that Professor Thompson made, net zero. So that's this liner here, Mexican born at the bottom, and you see right around 2011, it going flat. And so that's the population of people that were born in Mexico that are in the United States. And this is how they do it, actually. It's not, they don't have to count how many people are moving back and forth across the border. They just count how many people are here in the United States and whether or not you were born in Mexico. So they just do survey work to get that done. And the Pew Center is the ones who actually, they use a lot of census data, but they're the ones who go through and do the calculations for this. But it's a huge number that are Mexican origin. That's 34 million, and 11 million that are Mexican born, but it's flat. I mean, this has to do, in part, with the story that we've been talking about Mexico not just being drugs and thugs and all of that, right? Mexico also being a place that's moved from, low-wage manufacturing, low-wage, low-cost, low-skill manufacturing up towards more advanced manufacturing, moving up to having people that are, at the cutting edge of their professions winning Oscars last night. And that's one reason why there are less people leaving Mexico. Now, that's not the whole story. It also had to do with the recession in the United States. It also has to do with increased border security on our border. It also has to do with changing demographics, very importantly, in Mexico. People are having less kids. So there's less people entering the workforce every year, so there's less pressure on Mexico's own domestic economy to absorb all those workers, meaning the ones that aren't absorbed, there are fewer of them, who are the ones who tend to come to the United States looking for work. So there are changes underway that have to do with this. The phenomenon itself is changing dramatically what migration looks like. I mean, that changes U.S.-Mexico relations. Instead of talking about trying to stop Mexico, how do we stop you from sending so many unauthorized immigrants to us? The conversation now is about how do we work together to deal with the Central American migrants that are coming across? We remember this past summer, there's all this talk about the unaccompanied minors they're from the northern triangle of Central America, from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. There's a big conversation about what to do with them. So the United States says, well, Mexico, how can we work together on this issue? And Mexico's willing to be involved in that conversation because Mexico doesn't like the fact that it's a black eye on them. I mean, truly, it's horrific what happens to some of these migrants that are crossing through Mexico on their way to the United States. The percentage of women that are raped or experience some other sort of sexual assault is extremely high, probably over half. The numbers are hard to pin down, but a large percentage. People are kidnapped, they're extorted, etc. So Mexico doesn't like it. That exposes some of the underbelly, Mexico's nasty underbelly, but it also gives them an incentive to cooperate with the United States. So increasingly, conversations about migration between the two countries have to do with that, rather than the other piece. Let me just leave it there so we can move into some conversation. And I'm happy to go into more on some of the politics of migration in this country, or really any of the topics that I brought up.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so as per our usual modus operandi, we're going to have the Garfield scholars who have been formulating some questions for a while now. If you would like to congregate at either of the two microphones, you can form a little line on either side and ask your questions, and we'll have a round of that. And then once that's taken care of, we'll open it up to a wider audience. So those of you who have questions, maybe we'll have a handful over here, handful over here. Why don't you take a position, and we'll start with those questions. Okay, take it away.
Mexico's president was recently quoted, said the United States and Mexico have worked together to deepen our ties and diversify an agenda that reflects our strengths and common values. Together, we must build a more integrated, competitive, and prosperous North America. And my question is, as this innovation continues, would you predict that border control become more stringent to combat the current issue of illegal immigrants and immigration in general, or become more relaxed as the U.S. and Mexico continue to work together and improve their relationship?
Okay, great question. We have a couple of different pressures happening at the same time. On the economic front, there's a pressure to have less stress at the border, less buildup at the border, to make those economic interactions smoother, which means that the products that are co-built between the U.S. and Mexico become more competitive, whether they're being sold here at home or to be exported abroad. But on the other hand, we live in a post-9/11 world where we're worried about transnational terrorism in a very serious way in this country. And the nature, the way that we've managed our border was fundamentally changed after 9/11. Before that, at the U.S.-Mexico border, there were all these informal border crossings. People would walk across the Rio Grande at areas where it was shallow, and that was tolerated, I guess is the word for it. After 9/11, all those informal crossings were shut down. So there was a change in terms of what it meant to have border security, or what we asked for out of border security. And initially, that very much came at the cost of economics, at the cost of the quality of life for people that live in border communities, that were going back and forth across the border every day or many times a week to visit their family members, to go to school, to go to work. I mean, these are binational cities that have, they have an international boundary in the middle of them. So the pressure now, though, I think is actually to find a way to have it all, to do both, to have border security and lots of it. There's still a strong political pressure in the United States to do that, but to do that without messing up the economics and without messing up people's lives. And so let me just give you one example of a tool that works for that captures this notion. That in a nutshell is the notion behind the 21st century border that I referenced up there, is how to have it all. How to have a border how do you take measures that increase security and efficiency at the same time? And one of those is, they're called trusted traveler programs. I don't know, some of you may have heard of global entry at the airports, Global entry at the airport is basically you are pre-checked to go through the security lines a little bit faster. Basically, if you could prove to the government by letting them do a whole background check on you, telling them every place you've ever lived and a million other things about yourself, they will make a determination if you're a low-risk traveler. If they make that determination and you're considered a low-risk traveler, you get a special card and you get to use a special lane that moves you, in the case of the airport, through the customs line faster, or in the case of the border, you get a dedicated lane to drive through to cross the border. Well, that's good for efficiency because the people who use the border the most are the ones who can apply for a program like that. But it's also good for security because from a government perspective, you have limited resources. You have a limited number of agents, and they can only spend a limited amount of time on each person that's crossing the border, each car that's crossing the border. Well, if they don't have to worry about, they describe it as this: you're looking for a needle in a haystack because 99% of the traffic is great. It's just fine. But it's the needle that you're looking for. And so you have two options. You can either try to create a better needle detector, and they're trying to do that all the time, or you can get rid of some of the haystack. And that's what this is. You take the trusted travelers and you move them to another pile, and you don't not inspect them, but you inspect them less. And so it's a way that you can maybe have it all. So I think that's what we're trying to do, and hopefully that's what we'll actually achieve.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson, for talking with us. Myself and a couple of presidents, scholars over here, we got to have this wonderful opportunity to go to Pittsburgh and talk with David Petraeus at a conference a couple months ago. And he talks about this wonderful dream he has about Canada, the United States, and Mexico all coming together to be one unified superpower and basically be the superpower of the world, even rivaling Canada. So I was wondering if you could tell me if this was even a possibility and what this idea and the implication it has on the U.S. and Mexico relations.
Yeah. It depends on what you mean by that dream. It depends on what he means exactly by that dream. Because I worked at this Center for North American Studies at American University. One of the people that was sort of the intellectual grandfathers of some of these ideas, Robert Pastor, who just passed away, I guess about 2 years ago now. And he and others that sort of espoused similar ideas oftentimes took a lot of flack from people saying that they were trying to create a North American Union. If you look online, if you Google the term North American Union, you'll have a lot of fun. You'll find fake currency called the Amero. That's what we're all going to use when you don't have a U.S. passport anymore and your identity's been dissolved into North America. You'll find all this other, resistance to that notion, and that was not what anyone's ever actually proposing, I don't think. But essentially, the model that they're thinking of is a European Union style model, right? I don't think that North America will ever become the European Union, or not for a long way out. And what's happening in Europe today isn't making that time frame any shorter. So, what does it make sense for us to do? What do we want to do? Well, what we've decided already is that we'd like to, in terms of trade investment, we want to have a lot of integration. We haven't really decided, but de facto, we have huge amounts of social integration between all three countries, really. What we don't have, and something that I think he was thinking about, is a lot of coordination on foreign policy, on how we approach problems out there in the rest of the world. And Mexico in particular has been very reluctant to this, but something really interesting happened, I forget exactly how long, maybe 6 months ago, within the last year. Mexico announced that they were going to start getting involved in peacekeeping operations with the United Nations. Something that was, not imaginable just a handful of years ago. It was sort of an idea on the fringes of what Mexico should be doing. How can Mexico step up to take, Mexico is about the 14th largest economy in the world, and it wasn't acting like that on the international stage. It was so focused on relationship with the United States and so worried about, when Vicente Fox became president in 2000, his foreign minister was Jorge Castañeda. Oh, you did? So he's been here as well. So Jorge Castañeda, they took this opportunity, which was to get a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council in the early 2000s. And so they were on the Security Council in 2003 when there was a vote about the war in Iraq. And Mexico voted against it. it really fit Mexico's nature to vote against it. It wasn't actually that surprising that Mexico voted against it in some ways, but that was a big conflict with the United States. It ruined a lot of things that they were trying to accomplish together. And so this was Mexico's dilemma. How do we be more active on the United States, on the world stage, and not clash with our most important international relation, clash with the United States? So we've come away from a few steps forward from there already. I think there are big opportunities for more foreign policy cooperation. I think there are big opportunities to deepen economic cooperation. I think that migration remains a big sticking point, and this idea of labor mobility between the countries is a major sticking point. And I don't think that our goal is to have a single, a parliament necessarily. I think that, we as societies, not just the United States, but in North America, are a little less interested in building transnational institutions or international institutions, and are a little more interested in agreements, ways that we can cooperate. So I think the next steps anyway, they look a lot more like cooperative agreements than forming institutions that would bind us together.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Mr. Wilson. My name is Marcus, and I know the group that you belong to, you said was bipartisan. My question is really, what American political party would better suit Mexico-United States relations? The Democrats, they'd be more for an open border, more immigration-oriented, while Republicans are more for maybe business openness. You said the Pemex is no longer, the only oil company, and it's a lot of room for maybe American investors. So yeah, I was just wondering really the Democrats and Republicans for the better Mexico-US relations.
Okay. Traditionally in Mexico, they tend to like Democrats more. Because of some of those things. I think less conservative stance towards migration is one of the big ones that's there. Handful of other things. But in terms of actually the results, I don't think that the answer is so clear. NAFTA, which is one of the major sort of transformative pieces of transformative events in U.S.-Mexico relations over the last few decades, was started by President Bush. It had to be passed by President Clinton, but it was Republican that pushed that forward. And I think in terms of integrate, I think there are plenty of things. I work with members of Congress a lot, and they are now leading both houses, and so they have the leadership positions on the committees the people that I talk to. They don't have any problems creating a proactive, positive agenda with Mexico these days. And a lot of it's centered around economic stuff. But also in Merida Initiative on security cooperation, that's totally bipartisan. I mean, there's no one in the United States government that doesn't want Mexico to help the United States keep terrorists out, not let organized crime-related violence spill over in the United States. There are plenty of really bipartisan issues. So the traditional, the sort of old wisdom is that it's a Democrat, but I think it's a much more complex question than that, actually. Yes.
Hello, thank you for coming today. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. According to Shannon O'Neill, more people in Los Angeles, Houston, Sacramento, and Miami receive their nightly news from Univision as opposed to other network anchors. And how has the technology boom and rapid spread of information, both accurate and inaccurate, through the internet, social media, and television contributed to America's view of Mexico, and how might these media outlets and forms of technology be used to portray a more accurate picture?
Good question. A couple of years ago, we had someone, a visiting scholar at the Wilson Center, who did an analysis. He just looked at the New York Times. There's all this research that shows that stories that pop up in the New York Times first echo throughout traditional media throughout the United States, so it's a good place to start when you're having a look at something like this. And he looked at stories about Mexico, whether positive or negative, and what the subject was. And it was drugs and violence, and migration also, but less so actually. And maybe it's something to do with the year that he did it in, but it was pretty clear that the majority of media coverage in the United States about Mexico fits some of those words that we saw on from the survey. Yeah, Univision and Telemundo and La Opinión, which is one of the big newspapers in LA, rivals the LA Times easily, but it's a Spanish language newspaper, and some others, definitely cover Mexico differently. And so those who are, watching Spanish language news get a different impression about Mexico, one that's much more, there's just more coverage for one, and it tends to be, a little deeper coverage, more complex coverage as well. But the trend that's underway actually is one of the Latino population in the United States not watching Spanish language news, getting news from English language sources. So that's why you have things like Fusion, which is a new joint venture between Telemundo, I'm pretty sure it might be English, and I think ABC. Both of them actually have partnerships with one of the major networks these days. And they're trying to figure out ways to how do you hit that new audience, which is actually a faster growing audience, in fact, because, as some of these numbers of Mexican-born population start being flat, that market starts to become flat as well. So that's an important question, but I think the impact of the growing Latino population in the U.S. on U.S. politics and U.S. relationship with Latin America is the deeper question, at the root of your question, maybe even, and that is going to play out in lots of different ways over the next couple of decades. I mean, related to this idea that people are watching English language news more, is the idea that as people stay in the United States, they become Americanized. So even their attitudes towards Mexico change. If you look at sort of second generation or third generation children of Mexican immigrants, they tend to have very different views about things like migration than people who have been in the U.S. for a longer period of time. So I honestly think that it's a field. There are a lot of things that people point out as this. Texas is going to become Democratic because of the Hispanic vote, and this and that. Some of that stuff's true, but I think there's a lot of it that people are misreading. I think it's a much more complex picture than we look at. I think that the impact on politics, there are reasons it could be a push towards conservatism in terms of social values, things like that. But to pull it back to the media, I don't actually, outside of, I see that as a small sphere, a small space in which there's a much deeper coverage about Mexico, and outside of that, I think we're still seeing a lot of the same old stories come out. People who watch, people in the economic press, that's another area where there's different stories that are coming out. If you read Bloomberg a lot, or even the Wall Street Journal maybe, you'll see a lot more stories about these economic changes going on in Mexico, but on the mainstream press, it's still very limited.
Mr. Wilson, thanks for coming today. I wanted to get back on the topic of kind of borders a little bit, and how you were talking about trying to form more efficient yet secure borders with the U.S. and Mexico. And I was just wondering, because a lot of articles have been coming up recently about the Mexico southern border and how President has been taking into action, trying to model kind of how the U.S. and Mexico border deals with it, but it's been coming out a lot more harsh than it seems. A lot of negative connotations have been coming out of the southern border, a lot of violence from it, and I was just wondering how you were talking about whether Mexico should work as kind of more international, or just versus trying to establish this U.S.-Mexico connection. Should they be trying to reform their southern border policies a little more with their northern borders, or should Mexico just be focusing right now on trying to fix this U.S.-Mexico border first?
Good question. I'm actually going in 2 weeks to the Mexico southern border to look at some of those things and the new programs that are underway. Actually, I don't think that Mexico wants to replicate the U.S.-Mexico border at its southern border in any way. Although it is an important, it's a very good sort of comparison to think about the way that the U.S. looks at Mexico and sort of the size discrepancy and everything is in some ways replicated at Mexico's southern border. So, Mexico's relationship with Guatemala is actually in some ways similar to the U.S. relationship with Mexico. But no, they don't want to replicate what what we have, because Mexico's approach to migration, it actually changed over time, and around the 2000 with the President Vicente Fox, he came in. Like, throw my cell phone in there.
I turned this mic on.
Cell phones can do it sometimes. He changed the attitude of Mexicans towards migrants, and he tried to actually embrace the Mexican migrants that had left. They were traditionally sort of seen as deserters in Mexico, actually, and he turned them into heroes in a certain way. But related to that is a lot of Mexico's foreign policy in the U.S. I mean, a lot of the day-to-day, the consulates, which there's this huge network of Mexican consulates all over the United States, what they're doing on a day-to-day basis is protecting the rights of Mexicans in the United States, defending them. And they see that as difficult to do when so many of them don't have a documented status in the United States. So there's this sense that what we do in terms of the way we manage our border with them actually brings these human rights issues and brings a level of treatment of their people in the United States. It brings major problems into that. And so they don't want to replicate it in that sense. But I think they're torn between a policy of detain and deport, which would be more like the US policy in some ways, and one of regularize and protect. So regularize and protect would be give visas to migrants as they try to cross through Mexico on their way to the United States, so that if they don't get extorted, so they're not exposed to organized crime and violence in the way that they are now, so that you can protect them, so that they can go and to the police, for example. And a policy of detain and deport, which is we just want to stop this phenomenon from happening entirely, and so we're going to try to thicken the border there. And they're actually doing both simultaneously right now, which is a very hard thing to do. But they are doing that. And so I have a lot of questions actually about, I don't think Mexico has a clear policy about what they're trying to do at their southern border. But you're seeing things you're seeing the beginnings of a professionalization of the way that that border is managed. You're seeing the, placing of machines that can take biometrics so that they can keep track of at least who's crossing the border. You're seeing border crossing cards being given away for free where there used to be application fees, so they can try to encourage people to use the legitimate crossings. We're seeing inspection equipment being placed at different security belts up from the actual border itself, so there are multiple checkpoints. It's definitely an important thing, but it's not necessarily all that clear where they're headed with the policies.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks for coming. My question concerns border security also. You touched upon it on the first question with Alex's question, but mine's slightly different, so which I say. But first, I have a fun fact for the audience, another one. Since 2008, the Obama administration claims to have doubled fencing, unmanned aircraft security systems, ground surveillance systems, and agents on the border between U.S. and Mexico. However, in your report, the State of the Border report, you expressed many concerns with the increase of security, particularly the displacements of border families, and the loss of revenue and trade as a result of wait times in the border. Clearly, the wall is, as you mentioned in your answer for the first question, is a necessity and a hindrance. However, what U.S. state, in your opinion, has the best border security model, and why? And if none do, what do you see that model being?
Well, in the U.S., the border's federally managed, really. The states do, they have important policies that relate to it. Certainly a lot of states, in the absence of changes in our federal immigration policy, have gone to try to create their own immigration policy. So a lot of those have been struck down by the Supreme Court or by other courts, such as SB 1070 in Arizona. But in terms of actually managing the border, yeah, I don't think that, so in short, none would be my answer to your question. I don't think any of them have the model right. I think we have the framework of what we're trying to accomplish right, which is this notion of trying to have security and efficiency at the same time. I think that's a good policy framework. But I think we have a long way to go in terms of implementation. And along with sort of tools for increasing security and efficiency at the same time. One of those key tools, outside of sort of specific programs like I mentioned before, is collaboration and cooperation with your counterparts on the other side of the border. A great example of that is something that's happening with Canada right now. There's a pilot project. So one of the things the US Congress and security experts in the US have been clamoring about forever is that we don't know who leaves at either of our land borders. We don't have any program, any way we don't track exits at our land borders. We can do that on airplanes pretty easily because you have a passenger manifest. But in terms of the land border, we can't do that very easily. So with Canada, we have a pilot project underway that's being very successful to have Canada track entrances, which they've always done, and match that data up with our entrance data and count an entrance into Canada constitutes an exit from the United States in that sense. So that's a good border security measure that would not be possible without collaboration, and that allows us to increase security without adding this extra layer of extra gate or an extra crossing point at the border. We're not quite there yet with Mexico in terms of being able to do that. Mexico hasn't built up its own border crossings in the same way. But that would be the type of thing that I would point towards as sort of the ideal border crossing. Ideally, actually, when you cross the border, you cross twice. You cross once to leave the United States and once to enter Mexico, or once to leave Mexico and once to enter the United States. Having one border crossing where people, Mexicans and US officials, work side by side, sharing intelligence in real time, collaborating with one another in real time, halving the amount of work that they do because they don't have to do entries and exits. It's probably not actually halving, but lowering the amount of work that they have to do would be the ideal border crossing. And I also think that we count way too much on the border itself to do tasks that we want done. So if we want weapons trafficking to stop from the United States to Mexico, there are a couple of different approaches. You can stop everyone's car and look in their trunk before they go into Mexico, or you can have more effective enforcement at the point of sale or the point of trafficking, the methods of trafficking that get those guns to the border. Well, I think a lot of times, our tendency is to think in simplistic terms and say we don't want guns to leave, so where do we do that? The border. But oftentimes that's not the right place to do enforcement. Oftentimes away from the borders. So on immigration, do we build a wall or do we build a system, a better E-Verify system to look at workplace eligibility? I think they're two sides of the same coin, but they're very different in terms of the approaches. And so I think oftentimes you don't need to do stuff at the border, and when you do, I think you should do it collaboratively. To me, that's the ideal border crossing. Thanks.
Why don't we take one more from the scholars, and then we'll open it up to everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. What truly struck me from your presentation was the 40% content of finished good against Mexican exports. So I was kind of curious, with the rise of China, with lower wages in China and I guess business incentives to move industry to China, do you see this? I understand this is maybe an overall trade as well question. Do you see overall trade with Mexico increasing because of that? And also, does NAFTA currently give enough incentives, I guess, to continue to create stimulus to create growth in Mexico?
Two questions. Wages in China have risen. In the early 2000s, manufacturing wages in China were less than 20% of manufacturing wages in Mexico. Huge discrepancy, huge incentive for companies to relocate from the US or Mexico to China. They're on par now. Manufacturing wages in China are the same as manufacturing wages in Mexico. Now, that's a good thing for Mexico in terms of attracting businesses. Obviously, they would have liked to have grown their wages a little bit faster to help the population, the quality of life for its own population. But I actually think that over the last, there was a period from about 2000, 2001 to 2006, thereabouts, when Mexican competitiveness for wage reasons and a number of other reasons wasn't doing so well vis-a-vis their competitors like China and some other manufacturing countries. Mexico is a very manufacturing-based economy, that's why I keep talking about that. after that, really at the point of the recession and from there forward, there have been changes in a number of factors that have pushed production to become more local, closer to market, which is what Mexico's big advantage is, being close to the United States. So, but some of those are now in question again. So these are like the winds of the global economy pushing to and fro. And so oil prices were going up and up and up throughout the first decade of the 2000s, where we just had this huge crash. When oil prices are high, it's more expensive to ship goods from China to the United States. That means it's better to produce them in Mexico. But when oil prices are now low, well, that acts as a counterbalance to it. But throughout all of it, throughout all this to and fro, you've seen Mexico finding its niche, I would say, actually over time, honing in on what its role is in the global economy. And things like cars and airplanes are makes much more sense to produce closer to a market in a regional framework, in a North American framework, or even a framework of the Americas, than it does to have one platform for global production. So that's really where Mexico's niche is. So I think they're very well positioned for trade to keep growing between the two countries for several years. And that's what we've been seeing. We've seen, over the past 5 years, we've seen growth between US-Mexico in terms of trade outpace growth even with China, which is also growing extremely fast.
Great. Well, if anyone else has questions, feel free. You can go to a mic. You can stand up wherever you are, wherever you're comfortable.
I'm just going to use my voice because microphones just kind of freak me out. But so you talked about a lot of things. I keep hearing a lot about economic development. And I kept seeing a theme of a connection between education and economic development. I study education, so I'm kind of biased. But so there's a lot of interest and a lot of resources being dedicated toward this, macroeconomic policy that can foster this economic growth. The first thing I think of when is this other half of Mexico's population that is still living in poverty, and I think helping corporations get started and grow is a great thing. Mexico's done a lot of that. They're focusing a lot on entrepreneurship and education, but I seriously doubt that big corporations can bring half of the country out of poverty. So I'm just wondering what you have to say about other possibly more localized solutions or pilot projects that are being used to help make this growth more inclusive of historically marginalized populations.
Yeah, great question. And I actually think that some of the bigger economic changes that I was highlighting are putting an increased pressure on the increased importance on the role of education. So when your comparative advantage globally is having low-cost workers, low-skilled, low-cost workers, education only matters so much. I mean, they still need to have a certain skill level. Being able to read and write is pretty helpful, but it doesn't matter that much if their education level goes a whole lot beyond that. But as that gets and has gotten pushed out, I mean, Mexico doesn't make shoes anymore. That's gone. It's not coming back. And maybe some people would fight me over that, but they probably work in the industry. But t-shirts, textiles, those industries are gone, and the industries that are replacing them are, as I was saying, higher up the value-added chain, and they require higher levels of skill. So if companies are and more than that actually, technological change in general, this tools we use to produce goods around the world are making, if you look at sort of the pie, the cost of producing something, the part that's labor is shrinking over time for many products, most products really. So what that means is less and less it's about lower labor costs, and more it's about where you can find the right talent, where you can find people with the right skill set for the industries, whatever they may be, whether it's manufacturing or filmmaking or any number of other things. So I think that increasingly the ability to attract investment and to grow industry in Mexico will be dependent on the levels of education that people in Mexico have. And so basically the story that, to put it in a real nutshell, of education in Mexico is there have been great efforts to expand coverage. So the number of people, the percentage of the population that goes to grade school and goes to middle school is very high. It's over 90%. That goes to high school is a little lower, not bad though. Goes to college is still a problem. So coverage is still an issue when you get to higher education in Mexico, but coverage is pretty good at the lower to mid-level. Quality is not, and that's a huge, huge issue in Mexico. So this education reform, which was a constitutional reform, it made some significant changes to the structure of funding of education in the country. I think will be important there. I mean, to give an example, Mexico didn't know how many teachers it had. They still don't, actually, but they didn't know how many teachers there were in the country because they didn't even control the payrolls. The paychecks, the money went to the union who actually controlled the payrolls for the teachers throughout the country. And so as a part of the new reform, well, one, they actually did a census of their teachers to find out a little bit about them. But they also changed it so that hiring and firing would be based more on merit. Than people inherited teaching positions in Mexico before. People didn't, I mean, the number of teachers that were taking a salary and not even teaching was astounding. There were people, when people did analyses of payrolls in the areas where they could get their hands on them, they found sort of ghost entries in payrolls. So there were some important changes there as well, but there's a ton more to do. And I think this is an area that increasingly civil society in Mexico has become more and more active on also. There are the number of NGOs, civil society organizations pushing for real reform in education in Mexico is huge. Those were, I mean, the teachers union in Mexico, the biggest one, has over 1 million members. So this was like a political institution. I mean, I talked about the single party system in Mexico. This was a part of that single party system. They controlled 1 million votes just within this one organization. So they got to do whatever they wanted within their own sphere in return for giving their votes to the ruling party. And so that system found a way to live on for a couple electoral cycles with shifting alliances in Mexico, but it's kind of breaking down now, and that's really a good thing. But that's really just the beginning of the story, and what's left to do is reforming an education system.
Hi, Mr. Wilson. I'll try to make this quick. My question might seem a little narrow in scope, but I think it might have broader implications. Northern Mexico is going through a hydrological crisis right now, and it's sort of due to the southwestern states taking water from the Rio Grande, and then old, outdated policy from like the 40s and 50s allowing a third of the river to Texas and things like that. And I was wondering how this, if you've seen this as contention, in public policy, and whether this applies to other natural resources and sort of the country's wealth as far as trying to keep the giant U.S. away from another country's wealth, things like that.
No, it's absolutely been a point of contention, and it's also been a point of really interesting advance. And the bad side of the story is in Texas and at the Rio Grande, where they're still fighting kind of the old water wars that have been in play diplomatically for generations now. And where we've seen major advances actually on the Colorado River, where we've seen some new agreements that actually, I mean, this would be, it's a little smaller, so I wouldn't put it at the level of some of these full flips of these notions of sovereignty that I was talking about before, but it's a little one where we've seen things like, this was stimulated by, the agreement was stimulated because there was a small earthquake in northwest Mexico that broke down some of the infrastructure for water storage in the area. And so they reached out to the U.S. and asked if they could store some of their water. I think it was in Lake Mead, actually. And so they started these negotiations to do that, and ended up with negotiations to do much more. And they agreed to do that, so part of Mexico's water is now being stored in the U.S., and they're comfortable with that. That would not have been possible a number of years ago. They both agreed to give up a little portion of they had rights to reflood the delta of the Colorado River. The Colorado River, for the first time, is actually reaching the Gulf of California again now, and wetlands are being restored in that area. So, it's both. I mean, it's a point of contention, it's a point of opportunity, but there are big stresses on natural resources in the border region. The border regions of both sides of the border, the population is growing faster than our national averages. So northern Mexico has a higher growth rate than southern, really especially central Mexico. and our southern border, the communities there have a higher growth rate than the rest of the United States. That means they're using more and more resources. Agriculture continues to grow, continues to be there, but the other big one is fracking. So new exploration of shale gas resources, shale gas and shale oil resources, there's a huge concentration. There's the Eagle Ford Shale in South Texas, and there are some other similar structures on the Mexican side of the border that, because of energy reform, will likely be tapped into. That will put tremendous pressure on water resources in that region. So I think, unfortunately, on that side of things, we might expect those pressures to continue. But clearly, it's just obvious. These are transnational resources, right? These are resources that are shared between the two countries. So the only permanent solutions will be cooperative solutions. Otherwise, we're just going to keep fighting over this stuff. Yeah, thanks.
Hello. Thank you for the talk, Mr. Wilson. My name is Silla. My question is, do you think NAFTA is creating less job opportunities and lower wages for people in the United States since firms and corporations are relocating to Mexico, and then they're having Mexican workers with much lower wages?
So that was the big concern initially about NAFTA. This became a huge issue in the presidential elections in the early 90s with Clinton and Bush, and also Ross Perot came in as a third-party candidate. And he actually came in as a third-party candidate largely because neither Clinton nor Bush would oppose NAFTA, which still needed to, the agreement had been negotiated but not passed at that point. And he has the famous phrase of the giant sucking sound of jobs in the US that were going to flow to Mexico should we implement the agreement. And because wages were lower there, and so it was considered an unfair advantage. Interestingly, if you would have asked a Mexican at that time, is that what they expected? They would have said, no, we're really worried that all of our companies are going to close down because they can't stand the competition from the people in the United States, the companies in the United States that have access to all this capital, all these resources, all these production techniques that we just don't have. And so there was a fear on both sides that it could actually go both ways. What really happened? Well, okay, what didn't happen is there wasn't a giant sucking sound. There was not a major loss of jobs in the United States. In fact, in the years after NAFTA, there was a lot of job growth in the United States. But when people are parsing it out, trying to get to the bottom of what the implications were, it becomes more complicated at that level. And there were winners and losers for both countries. I think that much is clear. And I really believe that if we, in this country, if we don't find ways to have a trade policy, I believe that we're stronger together in the United States and Mexico than we are apart. And so I think if we want to compete with people around the world, with companies and countries around the world, we need to rely on sharing our comparative advantages, having Mexico do what it's best at, with the US doing what it's best at, and having economies of scale so that you can have production at the lowest possible cost. So I think that's what we need in the big picture, but how do you do that in a way that's politically possible and that doesn't hurt, that the losers aren't just left there abandoned, right? I mean, that to me is the core question of US policy towards trade and even globalization in a broader sense going forward. How is it that we can move people so that, because it's true, there was pressure put, wage pressure, and sometimes pressure to lost jobs. There are some that are registered even, because there was a program, Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, to help compensate some of the people who were documented to have found to have lost their jobs because of NAFTA. And it wasn't a huge number of cases that met that criteria, but there were some. And to me, the question is, how do you really help those people find something new, move to a new opportunity, rather than just giving them a handout and saying, sorry, too bad you're out of luck. Here's some extra unemployment insurance for a while. Here's an extra paycheck for a couple more months. But how can we as a society, and I think the answer is, it's such a big picture thing. It gets back to big picture questions about education, gets to big picture questions about how we can be competitive into the future. So I don't think it's something that you can rely only on trade policy to solve, but I think if we don't put a lot of effort as a society into figuring out the answers to these things, how we're going to move people into the industries of tomorrow, then we're going to keep having a lot of pressure to have policies that are narrow in the focus, not thinking of the ways that we can be more competitive together with our neighbors.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming to speak with us today. We've seen that Mexico's economy is growing and that business is booming there. As a college student with a little bit of money, I would like to know where I should invest. I know in your lecture you talked about some different companies, but what industries and businesses do you recommend investing in?
Good question. You need a proper financial advisor for this one, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. A lot of people are looking at the energy industry right now, right? That's a very exciting place to look because there are all these big opportunities, but there's these huge question marks now because of lower oil prices as well. So a lot of question marks there. Something that people have had huge success in over the last several years, I'm not sure if it's a little played out by now or not. It's kind of a question mark at this point, are real estate investment trusts in Mexico. They're called FIBRAs in Mexico. The first one only opened, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. There's still only 11 or 12 in the country that are listed on the stock exchange there, but they've had really good rates of return over the last several years. So there's my not very serious advice for you, because I don't really know the answer.
Thank you very much for the talk. Watching daily news recently, I know that drug war Mexico encourages transportation government towards those organizations. So obviously it's originating many problems to issues between US and Mexico. So with increasing collaboration between US and Mexico, how do you think the US and Mexico could be in this situation specifically?
Okay, sure. Thanks. So the question is basically, how will U.S.-Mexico cooperation on security, what will it look like going forward, and your observation that things might be, or at least continuing to be very complicated there. One of the things that's in play right now is because of the policy from the last administration, Calderon administration, which was to really go after criminal groups. It was to attack the criminal organizations and to largely go after the high-level targets, the leaders of these criminal organizations. That was one of the, that's not the only, but that was one of the causes, actually, of increase of violence, because the organizations would be decapitated and fragmented, and there would be a power vacuum and lots of smaller groups within them vying for power. So that's made it really difficult, actually, to deal with the situation, deal with the public security situation. I think increasingly we've come to understand that the focus of our policy binationally and within Mexico is not principally about drug trafficking. It's not even principally about organized crime. It's principally about public security. That's what it needs to be right now. There's a lot of stuff that we can do, but what we're seeing is, this was something I was going to talk about but didn't get into. We had in Mexico dual processes of democratization and decentralization. So you had this democratic transition happening where, for the first time in 2000, the PRI was defeated, and there's, first time in 1997 when there were opposition groups that had control of Congress. So multi-party democracy. And with that, some of the accountability mechanisms that come with democracy. That happened largely at the federal level, and it happened in some states, but it didn't happen in all states in Mexico. In fact, there are still, I think, 11 states in Mexico that have always had a PRI governor. They've never had a political transition at that level of government. So I bring this up because at the same time, there's a process of decentralization. The states were being given more power. It used to be very much a centralized system where the president had all the power. So the states are being given more power, and some of them can take it, and some of them can't. Some of them have some more democracy, and some of them don't. Some of them have effective institutions, and some of them don't. Some of them have police forces that function, and some of them have police forces that are run by organized crime groups. So you have this, unevenness of the capacity of government to respond. And the federal government cannot respond to everything in Mexico. There are around 70,000 total federal police in Mexico. There are around 400,000, a little over, local and state level police in Mexico. That's where the masses are. So state level capacity, local level capacity matters a lot. It's very uneven, the ability to respond to the situation. And where we've seen successes are in places where the states where they've had capacity. Even places like Ciudad Juarez, which a few years ago was the most dangerous city on the planet, statistically speaking, in terms of their homicide rate, has now had homicides drop 90% and is in a totally different, it's a totally different place than it was a few years ago. There was some capacity at that state level to respond to the situation. So now, I say all that when thinking about US-Mexico relations and cooperation because the question gets harder. It was easier for the US to come in and work in places like Ciudad Juarez and Chihuahua, that's the state there, than it is for us to work in places like Tamaulipas and Michoacan and Guerrero. And those are the states where we're seeing major problems right now. But we're frankly, you talk to USAID, the US aid organization, and they're afraid to go work in some of those places because of the security situation. But not only that, they can't find partners. They're looking for the trustworthy people to work with to rebuild a police force, and they're having a hard time finding partners. I still believe that it can be done. I actually think that what that means is you have to go further to the roots, and the roots, what was missing in those places, among other things, was a civil society that was organized and able to push government to be transparent, to be open, to take on change. The places where we've seen success were places where there were organized civil society groups that were able to get involved when they had to in these issues of crime and violence. And where those types of organizations were weaker, there's been very little capability to respond. So I think one of the things that the United States government can now do, one is keep working on police reform. This is just a huge thing. Two is keep working on criminal justice reform, which there was a constitutional change in 2008 in Mexico that's still being implemented. But three is to deepen the level of focus on what the term of art from the US perspective is building resilient communities. This is actually one of the official pillars of the Merida Initiative, which is the main security cooperation framework. But I think we need to focus a lot more attention on building resilient communities, building the civil organizations. We can't build them, obviously. All we can do is provide some best practices, provide some spaces for people to come together, but working with not just government, but also society, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Chris, I might claim the option here, perhaps the last question, unless there's one or two others, but I think it'd be really interesting to hear your response to this. You talked about NAFTA being this transformative moment. What do you consider to be the next key step in the NAFTA process as a NAFTA phenomenon, and what can the American policymakers, what is necessary to get American policymakers to implement that next step? And I guess the thing people often talk about is a customs union, but do we even need that at this point?
I mean, that's not what people are talking about in government. They're afraid to go there still. So what they're talking about, we have something now called the high-level economic dialogue between the US and Mexico. We have these North American leadership summits where the leaders get together, and now they're asking their departments of commerce to create a North American competitiveness work plan. And really what all this stuff is just, it's incrementalism. And that's important. They need to be, I mean, in the absence of something big, there are plenty of incremental issues that should be ironed out. But if we want to think big, I mean, I think we need to think about labor mobility, resolving this. What I talk about is, the missing piece that's still left in terms of migration. I think that's I think there are huge economic opportunities. If you look at the shape of this, the characteristics of the workforce in all three countries, there are huge potential complementarities that we're not fully taking advantage of because of migration policy. But yeah, I think a customs union is a fantastic idea. And I think that it's not just about the customs union. It's about, I mean, the big program that we have right now between the United States and Canada is called Beyond the Border. And what that really posits, what's really, the idea behind it is the idea of creating a security perimeter so that you can have within that security perimeter, this more movement, more flexibility, easier movement between the countries. I mean, I think, and the customs union, the way I see it, a customs union means creating a common external tariff so that all customs fees would be paid at the same level, whether a product enters from anywhere else in the world into Canada or the United States or Mexico. It doesn't matter which port they use. They just use one, they pay once, and then that means you don't have to do any more economic checks as you cross borders within North America. Right now, despite the fact that we have a free trade agreement, we have a huge amount of paperwork that needs to be done to import and export between the countries. And actually, you oftentimes need to do more paperwork to use NAFTA than to not use it, because you have to prove that all of your parts inside of your product were made inside North America, not anywhere else, because otherwise they'd be exposed to higher levels of tariffs. So getting a customs union eliminates that, eliminates the need for the border to function as anything except a security checkpoint. I mean, if you're thinking big, you combine that with an idea of a security perimeter, which will allow you to remove a lot, probably not all, security checks. I mean, that's 2 steps towards a border that's open. And I don't mean open in the sense that it's uncontrolled, because what you're trying to do is create a border that's both open and controlled at the same time. And so I think those are the dream big steps moving forward. But we don't have policymakers that are there yet right now.
Well, great. Do we have any last questions from people who won't be at the dinner and want to sneak something in before we take out? Okay, great. Well, then thank you so much. Great. So for those of you who are coming to the dinner, again, a slightly different operation. It will be over in Kortansky Hall. Feel free to mosey on over there, and then we'll reassemble and continue on. For those of you who aren't on dinner, as always, a pleasure to see you. See you next time. Thank you for coming. Good job.